time, John Quincy Adams had snuck into the White House thanks to a secret deal with Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson was really angry. So there were 4 years of people trading insults, and the 1828 election was going to be a rematch. At this point, there are no political parties in the sense that we're used to. The old Jeffersonian party had disintegrated. People hadn't really formed any new organizations, so it's just kind of loose coalitions of people who either want Adams or want Jackson. And by 1828, politics had entered kind of a new era. Virtually every state let every white man vote, so that the property requirements of the past were pretty much gone. Excuse me. And all but 2 of the states awarded their electoral votes based on how the popular vote went. So, I mean, it doesn't have to be that way. The states can choose how to pick their electors, but they lined it up with the popular vote. So, let's try that again, see if it actually works. Perhaps might help if I turned it on. Let's see. Yes. Okay. Yes, he can be taught. All right, so the election of 1828, as you can see, was a rout. Jackson got 56% of the popular vote, which was the record for the 19th century. Nobody did better. Jackson was the most popular and most active president of the 19th century. He was a character. And his inauguration day sort of gave a clue to the way life might be different under Jackson than it had been under the rather buttoned-down conservative presidents we'd had before. Let me go back there. Oh, there you go. So there he is. And I'm going to try to explain today why he is on the $20 bill. I mean, like, who cares about this guy? But there he is. And there are some reasons why he became important enough that the government decided to put his face on things. That's an engraving of his inauguration day. At the time, the city of Washington barely had 40,000 people. An additional 30,000 people showed up on inauguration day to cheer for Jackson. And after he was sworn in, everybody went to the White House for a party. And you can see there were a lot of people. There were so many people inside the White House, they were smashing the furniture, it was chaos. The servants started rolling barrels of liquor out onto the lawn in the hopes that it would lure people out of the White House. That eventually worked, and in the meantime, Jackson escaped out a back window, went back to his boarding house, and had a quiet dinner. Now, one of the things that Jackson is known for is that he treated public office, or I should say public jobs, as something up for grabs politically. He invented what that lovely man there, Senator William Marcy, he coined the phrase for it. There is nothing wrong with the rule that to the victor belong the spoils of the enemy. As Jackson did initiate what became known as the spoils system. Each time, from now until after the Civil War, each time a new party got the White House, that president would kick out almost all the people working in the post offices, all the people working in the custom houses, those were the main patronage jobs, and put his followers in there. And so it's kind of a revolving door. Jackson's theory was government service isn't all that complicated. Ordinary people can do it. And so I'm going to appoint ordinary people who happen to vote for me to take those positions. All right, so that's one thing Jackson is known for. That's a political cartoon of him on top of, that's a pig. That's a large pig. Another thing that he wanted to do was he didn't like American Indians, and he wanted to clear out the entire eastern half of the country and get all the Indian tribes out, move them somewhere else. Congress went along with it and passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Every single tribe could be forced to cross the Mississippi and reside somewhere in what the barren territory that they were now going to assign to Indians. You can see that the darker patch there running from what is now Oklahoma up into the Dakotas. All the tribes could be, not all were, but almost all were, pushed west. To help make that work, for the next several decades, the government extorted about 70 treaties with some of the tribes on the eastern side of the river, covering 100 million acres. They had a lot of land. The most notorious chapter of this removal process involved the Cherokee, who lived down in western Georgia. They were forced out, and in 1838, 16,000 of them headed west. It was October. It's going to get cold. The government provided absolutely no assistance on the trip. Food, shelter, blankets, nothing. 4,000 of them died on the trip. That's 1/4 of all of the people in the group. And it has become known to history as the Trail of Tears. One of the many shameful events in the government's relations with the American Indians. Another thing that Jackson did, he believed in using his veto power for political purposes. For the first 40 years of the country, there had only been 9 vetoes. And every time the president thought that there was a constitutional reason why a law shouldn't be allowed to go into effect. Jackson vetoed 12 bills because he simply didn't like them. It was kind of revolutionary that he would throw his political weight around that way. His most famous veto involved the Second Bank of the United States. And again, let's put ourselves back in the mindset of, in the 1830s, there's no national currency. The government doesn't print dollar bills. What people use to buy and sell things are notes issued by banks. There were hundreds of state banks in the country, and they issued notes that in theory could be redeemed for the value of the note in gold or silver. Of course, they didn't have anywhere near enough gold and silver in the vault, but it's a confidence game, right? As long you'll take one of their notes, if you're fairly confident you can use it with someone else and buy something. As long as you can get somebody else to accept it, you don't really care if the vault at the Bank of Washita, if that bank has pretty much nothing in the vault, you don't much care as long as people will take the paper from you. And this was really how business operated. You needed an awful lot of these banknotes as currency. The biggest bank in the country was the Second Bank of the United States, which had been created in 1818. And Jackson was suspicious of all banks. He was the kind of person who would just keep his cash under the mattress. He did not trust banks. And he particularly did not trust the Second Bank, which it was the place that held all the government's money. And it handled the collection of taxes, it handled the payment of services, and it also issued its own notes, which were 40% of the bank notes circulating as money. It had $32 million in the bank, which was twice as large as the federal budget at the time. So it's a big institution, it's private, and it's run by that gentleman, Nicholas Biddle, from a very wealthy Philadelphia family. And in 1832, Biddle and Henry Clay decided to ask Congress to renew the charter for another 20 years. It passed Congress, and Jackson vetoed it. And there you see a couple of political cartoons. It's hard to copy them in this setting, Back then, they used little balloons for the characters to talk, and they wrote in tiny little letters. So that people are saying things, and it's basically Jackson fighting with the Hydra of the bank on the left and smashing the temple of the bank on the right. The message is a strong statement of what Jackson stood for, and so I'll give you a quick quote from it. "The rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. Many of our rich men have not been content with equal protection and equal benefits, but have sought to make themselves richer by act of Congress." He has a genuine insight there. So one of the things he stood for was that government shouldn't do too much. It certainly shouldn't be captured by the people with money in order to pass programs like for building highways or building railroads or something, where it might theoretically be good for the country to have that railroad, but a lot of wealthy people were going to get even wealthier through the construction. He didn't want any of that kind of stuff. So the idea of it's me versus the wealthy is a theme in American politics that we've had off and on ever since, obviously. But it really begins with Jackson. Now you get to 1832, and of course the Democrats nominate Jackson again. They have a convention to make it official, and this is the first time that Jackson supporters used the label Democratic. They are now the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party that we all know and love is a direct descendant of Jackson's party that was made official in 1832. And they turned the election into a referendum on whether the bank veto was a good thing. There were his opponents, who were calling themselves National Republicans, and that's a label you do not need to remember because it disappeared very quickly. Anyway, the opponents picked Henry Clay. The standard Federalist program revived of having a tariff, spending money on internal improvements, having the national bank. And once again, Jackson wins easily. This time it's 55%, so he almost equaled his total from the 4 years earlier. And from this point on, heading into Jackson's second term, you really start having people building political organizations across the country under two labels. And the guy we can give a lot of the credit to, if you're happy that there are political parties, I'll put it that way. If you like them, then Martin Van Buren is one of your heroes because he organized the Democratic Party at a grassroots level, first in New York, and then as Jackson's vice president. When it was time for Jackson to retire in 1836, the Democrats nominated Van Buren. And I've found some of the posters for them. They called themselves the Party of the Working Man. Now, the opponents, at this point, the opponents are starting to use a label Whig. That's Whig with an H. Whig. I don't know if I got that right. Now, the title Whig for a political party sounds really old-fashioned, but at the time, it drew on British political history, and it meant that you were opposed to a powerful despot, an evil king. And as you can imagine, the king is King Andrew I. There's an engraving of him and his royal regalia. Their position in 1836 is Jackson has acted like a despot. He's just thrown his weight around and done whatever he wanted, and it was time to bring the presidency back in line and turn the government over to the businessmen, lawyers, and others in the middle class who really know how to handle things. Now, when you're the party of the wealthy than your opponents, it's not good to campaign on that necessarily. Trust us, we're rich, we know what we're doing. Generally doesn't work. So the Whigs emphasized class harmony. And you've heard this before. When the economy goes up, everybody benefits. Now, the fact that some people benefit a whole lot more than others isn't part of the message. But at this point now, so in 1836, you have actual political campaigns. There are rallies, people give public speeches, there are parades. Each side has newspapers printing favorable stories, there are pamphlets, and one of the key things to win an election was there was a lot of free alcohol at the polls. It was expected, if you were a candidate and had any thought of winning, that you helped all the voters get drunk on voting day. If you didn't, people would get resentful. Now, to run the election, the Whigs had just gotten organized. They didn't have any one leader to rally behind because they were just too new. So they picked several different regional candidates, like Daniel Webster, William Henry Harrison, picked them hoping that if the Whigs got enough votes in the different parts of the country, they could throw the election into the House of Representatives. It didn't work, and you can see that the blue Democratic Party there has largely taken over. But if you added up the totals, the Whigs were only 30,000 votes behind the Democrats. So this is now going to be, for the next several decades, a really contested political system between the Democrats and the Whigs. And when you get to 1840, the Democrats renominate Van Buren. And this time, the Whigs choose William Henry Harrison, who was a famous military hero. He had defeated a coalition of Indians led by Tecumseh at the Battle of Tippecanoe, which you may remember that name. He had been a senator from Ohio, but he did not have much of a political reputation, really. They picked a guy named John Tyler from Virginia to balance the ticket for vice president. And they innovate in this election. Running with a platform didn't work in 1836. So we're not going to bother telling the voters what we stand for. We're just going to use images, popular images. And so they flooded the country with Tippecanoe and Tyler II posters. They spread the story that good old William Henry Harrison was actually born in a small log cabin. In the one on the lower left there, it appears that William Henry Harrison likes hard cider. He's a man of the people. And you can't really read it, but the thing on the right there is sheet music. There was a campaign song, the Harrison Quadrille, which I guess was a dance way back then. Okay, so this is the first time a political party tried to run on pure image, and it worked. This was 80% of the voters turned out, which is astounding. Not the most in history, because there actually were a couple more at that level later in the century, but 80%. I mean, can you imagine that today? Harrison won all over the country. Harrison's the president. The Whigs sweep Congress. They've got the House and the Senate. But it turns out that the Whig Party had bad luck. And after only 1 month in office, Harrison caught pneumonia and died. And suddenly, the president of the country is John Tyler, who no one had given a second thought to, including the Whigs. He's the first vice president to step in, and so no one exactly knew how official he was. And his critics referred to him as His Accidency. Not excellency. And it turned out that Tyler wasn't really a Whig at all, so that every time Henry Clay got something through Congress, Tyler vetoed it. It got so bad that some of the Whigs in the House of Representatives filed the first ever impeachment motion. But it failed. They couldn't get enough votes. All right, so this brings us up to 1840. The next thing I really want to talk about is our war with Mexico. And the story of how we went to war with Mexico begins with the grand state of Texas. So, in 1821, a settler named Michael Austin got a land grant from the government of Mexico and opened up, invited some of his white friends from Louisiana and Missouri and places like that to come to Texas. The number of white settlers in that northeastern portion of the place grew and grew. By 1835, there were 35,000 white settlers and slaves. In 1835, the Mexican government decided it was about time to enforce its law against slavery. Mexico did not allow slavery. We, of course, did. And the white settlers in Texas certainly weren't going to take that. So in 1836, the white settlers had a little convention and seceded from Mexico. Mexicans sent their army in. As you probably all remember from school, they captured one force of Texans at the Alamo Mission near San Antonio. 250 men inside that mission were killed. The Mexicans executed everybody who came out and surrendered. But a month later, a bigger Texan army led by Sam Houston, that's him there, defeated the Mexicans, and they withdrew. In 1836, the Republic of Texas was declared, with Houston as the president. We've got that kind of funky map there because although the white settlers only lived in that eastern region, that's sort of the light yellow, they claimed that Texas actually consisted of all that stuff in the middle, kind of greenish on this particular map. So there was a dispute about exactly where Texas ended and Mexico began. Within a few years, the Texans decided it would be better to be a state than to be their own republic, so they applied to become a state. Tyler negotiated a treaty to annex Texas, and that became a key issue in the 1844 election. So we get to 1844, the Whigs once again go to Henry Clay. He's lost before, he's going to lose again. The Democrats, though, don't have any clear person to run as president, and you have a convention with ballot after ballot, fist fights on the floor of the convention. Not even the Democratic convention in 1968 had fist fights on the floor, I don't think. But in any event, it was a chaotic convention, and finally the convention picked James Polk, the first person referred to as a dark horse candidate. He had been governor of Tennessee, he had been Speaker of the House, so he had political credentials, but he was not a leading Democrat in the country. They went with Polk, and their platform was simple. We want to annex Texas, and we want to get California. And this idea that what's really most important for America right now is to gobble up more land reflected a very confident, aggressive mood in the country in the 1840s. And there's a Democratic journalist named John O'Sullivan, who coined the phrase that has stuck for this view of the world. America has a manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent, which Providence has given to us for the development of the experiment of liberty. Okay, so that is a white settler version of what God has in mind, in which it didn't matter that people were already living here. God gave it to us so that we could show the world how liberty really worked. The vote was close in 1844, but Polk won. He won enough states by small margins that he swept the Electoral College rather nicely. I don't know how many people in here even remembered the name of James Polk, but it might be worth it because he is one of the most successful presidents we have ever had. Truly. He had 4 things that he wanted to do, wanted to accomplish. He wanted to lower the tariff. Congress promptly lowered the tariff. He wanted to create something called an independent treasury that would hold the government's money instead of putting it in a bank. That's a technical thing you don't need to care about, but he wanted it and he got that too. And it was important at the time. And he wanted to get Oregon and California. It turned out that getting Oregon was really quite easy. Secretary of State James Buchanan negotiated a treaty with Great Britain to resolve the question. Up until the last 20 years or so leading up to this, the area that we now think of as Oregon and Washington was kind of amorphously ruled by both the U.S. and Great Britain. And there wasn't a boundary, there weren't that many people living there, or I should say white people. So this treaty that Buchanan was able to negotiate extended the boundary line to what we are now used to. Takes the line past the Rockies and over to Puget Sound. All right, so this way, third objective accomplished. We have now gotten full control over what was known at the time as the Oregon Territory. Now, it was a bit harder for Polk to get California, and his strategy was to provoke a war with Mexico, which controlled California at the time. So what happened? In 1845, Congress approved the annexation of Texas. Mexico immediately broke off relations with us. And there was confusion, as I said, about where Texas ended. The settlers were in that northeast part. You have a few rivers that come down to the Gulf that could be a boundary. The traditional boundary was the Nueces River. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but it's the blue line that runs, it's the second one up that has a label on it. So there's some bit of Texas there, but there's still a portion below it that's still Mexico. And there was a dispute about whether Texas included the land all the way down to the Rio Grande River. Now, Polk doesn't care about what the traditional boundary might be. He sent the U.S. Army down there to the Rio Grande to stake our claim that we owned everything up to that river. The Mexicans, of course, sent their army on the other side of the river to defend Mexico. And when you got, one army on one side of this river and one army on the other side, inevitably somebody shoots at somebody else. There was a little bit of shooting, but Polk went to Congress and asked for a declaration of war because Mexico had invaded the United States. That was not true. Congress obliged, Congress declared war, and immediately American forces immediately the few white settlers in Upper California declared their independence from Mexico. A couple weeks later, a U.S. Army led by John Fremont made it to Sacramento in San Francisco, that area, and another army headed down a southern route and occupied what is San Diego and Los Angeles. So within the space of a few weeks, we had occupied and then annexed California. As soon as California became part of the United States, the white settlers there essentially declared war on the American Indians who happened to live there. This is a direct quote from the governor of California in about 1850. That a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate, here, like he believes this, we cannot anticipate this result but with painful regret. But the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert. Can you spell genocide? That's certainly what he was thinking. And over the next 25 years, it is estimated that white settlers murdered 16,000 Indians in Upper California. Now, the part of the war that involved Mexico itself didn't last very long. You had one American army led by Zachary Taylor that came across the Rio Grande and arrived by land. A different army led by Winfield Scott got into boats, landed down on the Mexican coast, and it took less than a year to get to Mexico City. That's an engraving on the lower left there, the occupation of Mexico City. Mexico, of course, was forced to make a treaty with us, and Mexico ceded its claims to Texas above the Rio Grande, and it gave up what is currently New Mexico, Arizona, and California. We paid them $15 million for all that land. As a tiny aside, there's that little sort of orange patch right down below Arizona. It turned out that little chunk happened to be the best route for a railroad to go from Texas to the Pacific, so we also bought that from Mexico a few years later. It was known as the Gadsden Purchase. And so with the settlement of the fighting with Mexico, the southern boundary of the country looks like what you're used to. And in fact, the borders of the continental U.S. haven't really changed since then. Now, a lot of people were on the move in the 1840s, and I want to talk about some of that because it's really an important part of the American experience in the time. In 1848, gold was discovered near Sutter's Mill near Sacramento, and it triggered an overnight gold rush. You can find photos of some of the miners on the internet, and you can see where Sutter's Mill was. The white population of California went from 10,000 to 100,000 in a year. The main port to bring in supplies and send out the gold was San Francisco. San Francisco grew from 1,000 people to 35,000 people in 2 years. That's it as it starts to spread on that map. Within 10 years, they'd mined out more than $500 million worth of gold. It was a kind of a staggering increase in American national wealth. Another group that was on the move in the 1840s was the Mormons. They were founded in 1830 by Joseph Smith in upstate New York. There's a painting of him around the time of the founding. He was only 24 years old. And he claimed that he had been visited by an angel, and the angel showed him where to find buried gold tablets, and the tablets contained the Book of Mormon, which has since been, of course, printed and circulated. Not too surprisingly, Smith and his followers were persecuted by local Protestants who considered them to be heretics. I've just been visited by an angel who showed me where the golden tablets were, that was kind of funky enough for the local Protestants to take issue with. But Smith also and his followers practiced bigamy, which they justified as being something that's in the Bible. You know, Abraham, lots of those old patriarchs had multiple wives. So they didn't consider it a bad thing. They thought the Bible sanctioned it. But their neighbors generally did think bigamy was a bad thing. And the Mormons were driven from New York down across Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois, one place after another. And in 1844, a mob killed both Smith and his brother. It was in Carthage, Illinois. The man in the upper right there, Brigham Young, took over at that point. And Brigham Young's solution is, let's go someplace where nobody can find us. Well, nobody will care where we are. And he led 150 Mormons in 1847. He led them all the way to Great Salt Lake. And within just a couple more years, there were 11,000 settlers there. Some engravings of what it might have looked like back then. It's obviously, there's nobody there. This is a region that was unsettled. Partly because there's just no clean water, right? Great Salt Lake isn't You can't really farm with Great Salt Lake too well, I don't believe. So for the time being, the Mormons are out there building their experiment in a religious community that they believe the Bible has sanctioned. And for the time being, the government did leave them alone. Now, I mentioned before that the common wisdom in the first part of the century was that there's nothing, you can't use the Great Plains for anything because it's just too dry and there's too much prairie grass that you can't get rid of. But American technology solved that problem in the 1830s. The man on the upper left there is John Deere. John Deere invented a steel plow. And with your steel plow, you can churn up the prairie grass and turn over the soil and make it something you can plant wheat or corn on. Around the same time, Cyrus McCormick, lower right, invented a mechanical reaper for harvesting. And with that reaper, you can harvest 8 times as fast as a man on foot by himself. So between the ability to plow and the ability to harvest a lot more stuff, white settlers start moving into the Great Plains. And what am I talking about as the Great Plains? It's basically Iowa, and then the strip of land that runs from Oklahoma all the way up to the Canadian border. People, it's gradual, but white settlers are moving into all of those places, and slowly but surely you can anticipate that there will be showdowns with the American Indians who already live there. Now, some Americans wanted to go even further west than the Great Plains or Great Salt Lake, and you started having regular trails as ways to head west. And they all seemed to start at Independence, Missouri. And the main one, which is on the red line there, goes up the Missouri and then across the Rockies, finds the Columbia River and ends up at the Pacific. There was also a trail that branched off to California, and there was another trail that branched off into the Santa Fe. There's a closer map of the Oregon Trail, and there are some photos to give you some idea. You're in a wagon, right? All your belongings are in the wagon. You've got a few horses, if you're lucky. Families riding along or walking, and that's the landscape. There's like not much there. You're hoping that you'll go through that landscape and end up at some place where you can farm. And I like to sort of imagine to myself, suppose you're in one of those wagons and you finally come up over a ridge in the middle of Colorado, which is a plain for the most of it. You come over a ridge and suddenly there's the Rocky Mountains. I mean, can you imagine how scary that must have been? You need expert help to get through the Rockies because there aren't that many places you could do it. It was a grueling trip, and there are still gravestones left behind of people who died on the trip. That's what you can sort of read in the lower right there. By 1850, there were 13,000 white settlers in Oregon, starting farming. During the same period, other people are on the move coming here from Europe. From 1845 to 1855, there was a massive wave of immigration from Ireland and Germany. Ireland was suffering from the potato famine, but I read this once. Potatoes are one of the absolute best things. If you could only eat one food to stay alive, potatoes are apparently your best choice. They've got the vitamins, they've got whatever you might need. And our agriculture in Ireland had become very dependent on the potato, and when the crop failed, millions of people died. And hundreds of thousands came over here. Most of the Irish settled in northern cities or headed out to places like western Pennsylvania and western Virginia where there were coal mines. Later on, many of the Irish work on the railroads, but we haven't quite gotten there yet. The Germans were driven out by a series of bad harvests, and there had been an attempted revolution in 1848 that had been crushed by the Austrians and the Prussians. So you've got, within that 10-year period, 3 million Irish and Germans came over. Per capita, it's the biggest period of immigration in the country compared to what the existing population was. Most of the immigrants were Catholic. I mean, obviously, pretty much all the Irish, but most of the Germans, too. They were coming from a region in southern Germany where Catholicism had lasted through the Reformation. Now, with all these Irish and Germans, Catholic, coming and arriving, the white Protestants who already lived here were upset and scared. And there was quite a bit of prejudice against the newcomers, who were considered to be drunkards, basically. That political cartoon in the upper left, you've got one guy wearing a barrel that says Irish whiskey, and the other guy wearing a barrel that says lager beer. That political cartoon on the right is the cartoonist vision of what Irish men look like. Okay, that's not very realistic. And there was serious prejudice to keep the Irish out of any kind of decent jobs. And even young women who wanted to go into domestic service, I don't know if you can read those two want ads I've got there, but no Irish need apply. That was quite common in the 1850s. And as we'll see next week, the arrival of all these Irish and German Catholics actually led to the creation of a new political party designed to keep them under control. Now, moving around the country became easier in this period thanks to the railroad. You might not know this, but the first railroad in the United States ran 3 miles from a quarry in Quincy down to a dock on the Neponset River. And on the upper left there, apparently the tracks are still there. You can walk along the path that it took to get to the Neponset. That was 1826. Within a few years, the Baltimore and Ohio offered passenger traffic. And to make it easier, Congress and the states did all they could to encourage railroads to develop. In the 1850s, Congress handed over 20 million acres so that the railroads could build tracks. By 1860, this is what the network looked like. The red lines are where it was in 1850. The blue lines are what was added in the 1850s. Railroads pull the country together in an unprecedented way. Before, it took 4 days to ship something from Concord, New Hampshire to Boston. You'd put it on the Merrimack River, then you'd put it on the Middlesex Canal. It would take 4 days. With the railroad, it took 4 hours. The trip from New York to Chicago took 3 weeks. With the railroad, it took 3 days. The Midwest was now accessible. And if you want to, another way of communicating that was growing in this period was good old Samuel Morse there invented the telegraph. He did it in 1844, and within just a few years, whenever they built a railroad, they also were putting up poles to carry the telegraph wires. In 1856, Western Union Telegraph was formed to manage telegraph traffic. And I found an actual telegram there from the 1850s. And I can't read what the man was saying, but there it is. Other ways to communicate. Wells Fargo didn't start out as a bank. It started out as a company with stagecoaches. They ran stagecoaches from St. Louis to San Francisco. You could get there in 23 days, which at the time was considered remarkable. If you wanted to send your message, if it absolutely positively had to get to the Pacific coast really fast, you used the Pony Express, which also opened in the 1850s, and that their riders could take 8 days to go from Missouri to Sacramento. Now, I hope you can read the recruiting poster for the Pony Express there. If you can't, I'll read it for you. They are looking for skinny, wiry fellows, not over 18, willing to risk death daily, orphans preferred. All right, so so another thing I want to talk about is the 30s and 40s were an excellent period for American literature, which didn't really exist during the colonial era or the beginning of the 19th century. But over the course of the first 50 years of that century, writers that you actually know about and people still read came along. The first well-known American writer was Washington Irving. He began with a history of New York State by an imaginary Dutch historian named Diedrich Knickerbocker. Knickerbocker was a nickname at the time for Dutch settlers along the Hudson. A few years later, he produced stories in a book called Sketchbook, and stories include Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, where Ichabod Crane, who I think might have been played by Johnny Depp. Was he? Somebody. Anyway, they made a movie, of course. All right, so Irving was the first writer to get some national attention and even to be read in Great Britain. The first truly successful American writer was James Fenimore Cooper, known for what were the leather stocking tales. They're set on the frontier in upstate New York. And the most famous, of course, are The Last of the Mohicans. Who was in that one? Daniel Day-Lewis? Yeah, they make movies of all this. And The Deerslayer. So they are two early authors who became well-known. And then there was somebody trying to help us understand how we spoke English. Noah Webster dedicated decades of his life to this difference between how the British speak the language and how Americans speak the language. His first dictionary appeared in 1828 and became a bestseller and has been with us ever since. From 1828 to the Civil War, the roster of American authors is truly impressive. Ralph Waldo Emerson, he wrote poems, and he was one of the first people to make a living traveling the country giving lectures. Maybe I should do that. No. One of his themes was that American writers should not imitate what the folks in England are writing, but should write about American themes with an American language. He was a controversial figure. He'd been trained as a minister, and in 1838, he was invited to give an address at the Harvard Divinity School. And Emerson used it as an opportunity to explain that Jesus was just a great man, but not God, which didn't go over well with the people at the Divinity School. Emerson is remembered as kind of the leading representative of transcendentalism, which I can't really pretend to explain in this setting. Actually, I couldn't explain it at all. But it's kind of like the idealism of the 1960s. There's got to be more to life than the material world of just going out there, working, making a living. You do that over and over, and then you die. There's got to be more to life than that. And Emerson and his friends were looking for some sort of spiritual connection with something greater than just us. Another writer, also from Concord, was Henry David Thoreau, really the nation's first naturalist. He spent a year in a cabin on Emerson's property near Walden Pond, and you can see a replica of the cabin if you go there. Some of you have probably seen it. It's adjacent to the parking lot, just up from the lake, or pond. Thoreau also was an advocate of civil disobedience. He went to jail because he refused to pay taxes to support the war with Mexico. Emerson came to visit him in jail, and Emerson said to him, "Henry, what are you doing in there?" And Thoreau said to him, "Ralph, what are you doing out there?" Another writer connected with Concord and New England is, of course, Nathaniel Hawthorne. He lived for a while in Concord. For a time, I mentioned political patronage. For a few years there, Hawthorne was a loyal Democrat and got a patronage job at the Salem Custom House. And I think the interior is still decorated in the manner it would have been when Hawthorne was working there. His big theme, of course, is Puritan guilt. I don't know if the man ever smiled. He did have a wife and he had kids, but anyway, it's hard to tell from that photo. Another author with at least a Massachusetts connection is Herman Melville. He grew up in Pittsfield. That's his house, down at the bottom there. He made a name for himself. He'd been on whaling ships, and he made a name for himself writing tales about the South Sea Islands. And he sold a lot of them. And then in 1851, he released his magnum opus, Moby Dick. Nobody understood Moby Dick. The critics panned it. It only sold 3,000 copies in his lifetime. Okay, I mean, it's amazing to think of, but what is now considered one of the landmark achievements in American literature went unnoticed at the time. Another fellow who wasn't appreciated in his time was Edgar Allan Poe. He received legal permission to marry his 13-year-old cousin Virginia. There she is. And when she died at the age of 24, it totally ruined Poe's life and sent him down a spiral of alcoholism, essentially. People didn't appreciate his poems or his short stories, his tales at the time. He lived for a while in the middle there. He lived in Philadelphia for a while in that house, and then when Virginia died, they were living in the Bronx. It's hard to believe that little white house is in the Bronx, but somehow it's been preserved all this time. Oh God, I am really running late today. Sorry. It was an era, the publishing industry, printing houses really expand in this period, and you have new newspapers and new magazines. I just want to throw up a few familiar names because most of those are still with us. The Boston Herald goes back a lot further than the Globe. I think about at least 30 years. Okay, I would want to talk next about, I can't do this subject justice, but a little bit about what life was like for women in the country. Most of what I talk about is what white men did, because white men kind of ran the place, wealthy white men. But half the country were women, and I have, it's going to sound pretty obvious, but being a woman in the mid-19th century in America was hard work. It was hard work. 2/3 of the country still living on farms. I found some photos of farm women from the mid-century, and you spend all day caring for your children, raising vegetables, tending to the farm animals, making meals, and making clothing. You've got something to do 24/7. About 10% of women in the country in the mid-century worked outside the home and got paid for it. And many of them worked in the textile mills. I've found some engravings, and that photo on the lower left are a whole lot of mill girls from Lowell. 70-hour work week. It's 100 degrees in the mill to keep the fiber moist, so they don't open the windows. And there's cotton fiber in the air, obviously. White lung disease. Working in the textile mills was a really dangerous thing for a young woman to do. Other occupations that you got paid for, there were servants. Many women were servants, like the ladies in the upper left there. Women took in laundry. People didn't have washing machines. Somebody had to wash the items, and there were professional laundresses. and women making clothing in factory settings, seamstresses. Now, if you were in the middle class, the challenge was a bit different because you weren't expected to work for money. You were expected to be the perfect wife. And the middle class attitude about women in the middle of the 19th century was there's two spheres in the world. There's where men belong and there's where women belong. Men are stronger inherently and smarter inherently, and they are suited for the worlds of business and politics. Women are emotional and weak. But women have special spiritual and moral faculties. Put in the right setting, women can raise children wonderfully, and they can maintain a home that the husband is happy to come home to after a hard day's work. The myth of what a married woman is supposed to do really goes back to this period for the middle class in the country. And there was literature, there were magazines like the one in the upper right there, perpetuating these stereotypes, with illustrations and with stories about what women were supposed to be doing. There were, fortunately, some women who didn't go along and who started questioning and in a sense, fighting back. One of them was Margaret Fuller. She lived in that house in Cambridge for a while. She was a good friend of all the Transcendentalists and actually was the editor of their monthly magazine, The Dial. She wrote a book, Women in the 19th Century, about how women shouldn't be stuck at home but should have social and political equality. I got a copy, it's still in paperback, and it was a very good read. In 1848, Horace Greeley, a newspaper editor, hired her to go to Italy and report on a revolution that was happening. And she did, and on their trip back in 1850, the ship wrecked off the coast of Fire Island, and Margaret Fuller, her husband, and their son died. They never found her body, but there is a memorial to her in Mount Auburn Cemetery. Now, a couple other women we need to pay attention to are Elizabeth Cady Stanton up there on the left and Lucretia Mott up there on the right. Elizabeth Cady was very well educated by the standards of the day. Her father made sure she got a good liberal education. She married a well-known abolitionist named Stanton. They omitted the word obey from the marriage vows because, as she put it, I obstinately refused to obey one with whom I supposed I was entering into an equal relation. She added his last name to hers, so she's known to history as Elizabeth Cady Stanton. For a while, they lived in Boston, and she was friends with Emerson, but then her husband moved them to Seneca Falls, New York, which is way the heck out there between Syracuse and Rochester. And she felt trapped. Raising children in this small town wasn't the life she had been looking for. In 1848, an abolitionist named Lucretia Mott, there on the right, happened to be passing through town. And they decided, they talked about the plight of women in the country, and they decided to have a meeting about it. And they put a notice, there it is, in the local newspaper for a women's rights convention. They were shocked when 200 women and a few men showed up. It was a real event. They met in that Methodist chapel in Seneca Falls. There's an engraving of what it might have looked like, and the convention adopted a declaration of sentiments which says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. Stanton's husband left town so he wouldn't be around when this happened. Stanton's father showed up and wanted to have her inspected for insanity, and he threatened to disinherit her. But she did not give up, and Stanton went on with women like Susan B. Anthony to lead the women's suffrage movement. It's going to take another 70 years before women get the right to vote. Now, it is a period of, again, like I said, it's sort of a little bit like the 1860s. You had a lot of people in the country cooking up ideas about how to make the country better. One involved education, more schools. The country would be better off with more schools. And it was, in Massachusetts, it was pioneered by Horace Mann up there. Massachusetts, we have a lot of firsts. We had the first public elementary school in the country. That's it there in the middle. We had the first public high school in the country, Boston English. We had the first public high school for girls in Worcester. That building's gone, unfortunately. And there was a state law that every town had to have a schoolhouse. And so, the countryside is dotted with all those little red buildings. I think forgot what two towns those are in, but they're both from Massachusetts. Other states in the North and Midwest followed, and by 1840, 90% of adults in the North could read. The South didn't keep up, and the literacy rate in the South was much, much lower. Another prominent reform was temperance. Maine prohibited the sale and consumption of alcohol in 1851, and a dozen other states followed suit in the 1850s. The laws didn't survive the Civil War, though. The most important reform nationally in this period is, of course, the opposition to slavery. One of the leading figures was William Lloyd Garrison from Boston, who began publishing The Liberator in 1831. More famous, deservedly so, is Frederick Douglass. Douglass escaped from slavery in Maryland in 1838. He wrote his autobiography in 1845. That, too, is available as like a Penguin classic. It's a really good book. Really good book. And then a couple years later, he began editing his own anti-slavery newspaper, the North Star. And he explained his mission with that newspaper. It has long been our anxious wish to see in this slave-holding, slave-trading, and Negro-hating land a printing press and a paper permanently established and under the complete control of the immediate victims of slavery and oppression. He was going to be the voice of this for the slaves themselves. Abolitionism was not popular among white people in the North. A mob threatened Garrison with hanging at one point. An editor of abolitionist newspaper was murdered out in Illinois. Mobs had destroyed his first 3 printing presses, and when he was shot to death while defending his 4th printing press. That was out in Illinois. There were hundreds of attacks on abolitionists. There were newspapers, pamphlets, and the American Anti-Slavery Society started mailing those throughout the country, particularly down south. Andrew Jackson told the post office not to deliver them anywhere in the South because they might stir up trouble. And Congress also, and I am just about done, I apologize for running over, Congress also tried to stifle discussion of slavery. John Quincy Adams, after losing the presidency, had been elected to the House of Representatives. And from 1830 to 1848, he delivered abolitionist petitions to the House, kept bringing them in, putting them on the table, and asking that the House debate them about that we should get rid of slavery. It got to the point that the House refused to even acknowledge that the petitions were being delivered. That didn't stop Adams from introducing them, and that cartoon at the bottom is him lying on the ground protecting his petitions from Congress. He died in 1848 while giving a speech against slavery on the floor of the House. He had a stroke. A very brave man. And so that brings us to 1848, and I need to stop here. Next week we're going to follow the story to show just how disastrous having slavery really was going to be for the country. And in the 1850s, we'll see the country completely flying apart. Anyway, thank you all for being here. Next week, same time, Wednesday at 2 o'clock.